Upscaling and fake frames are back in coverage, but this time from a fully agnostic solution, which is Lossless Scaling. Lossless Scaling is a $7 tool on Steam with a near cult-like following, and it can do 20x frame generation. Now, to be clear, that doesn't look particularly good, but it can do it, and it's cool. Lossless Scaling is complete with not only memes and intense enthusiasm, but also features that aim to agnosticize some of the features that NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel maintain. Lossless Scaling isn't meant to be a replacement for a vendor-provided solution that has a direct integration, particularly with the game developers and the games they make. That's probably going to be the best solution if it exists for what you're using. And in theory, it offers a cheap option to push older GPUs across the finish line. Now, frame generation can't make 30 FPS feel like 60 FPS, but it can help smooth things over. Today, we're gonna be digging into the quality of one of the upscaling options in Lossless Scaling. They have a lot of them, so we're really just focusing on one, and we're looking at some of the image quality comparisons for frame generation. This is not fully conclusive of the entirety of Lossless Scaling as software. What we're doing is looking at the most commonly used parts from what we can tell to provide a bit of analysis on it, image quality analysis. And we've done this already for DLSS and FSR. We would like to do it for XeSS as well. This currently is not a competitive comparison against those, burning all the airtime to focus only on Lossless Scaling to kind of go as in depth and drill down on this one thing as we can. So part of this testing involves intentionally slowing down everything, and that means going frame by frame sometimes, which means we are intentionally trying to find problems. Now, the important thing to remember here is that in real world play, you might not notice things that we're intentionally looking for because we're doing an inspection of image quality. But then the reality is practically, you're probably playing the game. You're not really gonna like stick your eyes to one quadrant of the monitor and play it for frame by frame to see how it looks. But we're gonna play some of the games back at normal speed at the scale 1 zoomed out so that you can get a look for how it might actually feel in gameplay in addition to the frame by frame that we do. All right, so that's the plan. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Height Y70 Touch Infinite. We previously reviewed the Height Y70 non-touch series and found its overall build quality to be good and competitive. Now, the Y70 Touch Infinite ships with a custom 14.9-inch IPS touchscreen with a 60 Hz refresh rate. The screen connects to your system build and can be used as a showpiece on the angled corner front panel, displaying stats, music players, videos, and more. Height's entire Y70 series now also includes multiple new colors, like the Taro model that you're seeing here. Learn more at the link in the description below. Currently, Lossless Scaling is the second best seller in the software category of the Steam store. It's right behind Wallpaper Engine and above all the VTuber apps and RPG makers. One thing you should be aware of with Lossless Scaling is that it's deservedly well liked for its versatility. The tool theoretically really shines in emulation. Theoretically, we would never test that. That's not allowed, so we can't test that. If we had tested it, it would work pretty well for emulation, but we didn't because we can't. Official tools have limited support here for obvious reasons. We won't be able to demonstrate that because we'd possibly get a channel strike again, and it'd also risk the video being taken down again. Especially if we were to emulate the side hustles that come out of the gaming industry's favorite law firm, Nintendo. There's a bunch of other cool features in Lossless Scaling, Lossless Frame Gen that just as an enthusiast you might think they're kind of fun, but we're not going to really delve deep into them today. A couple examples though would include that you can use these outside of gaming applications, so if you want to use them in video playback, you can. There's also pixel art applications, although feasibly you could use different integer scaling solutions such as in the NVIDIA control panel for that. There's a separate branch for Linux support for Lossless Frame Generation. There's an adaptive mode that's pretty cool where you can just set a target frame rate basically, and there's a dual GPU mode that's super cool where you can offload the work to a lower end older card. Again, this isn't going to be as good as a native DLSS or FSR implementation, but it doesn't have to be. It's not made by one of the 3 companies that has a side hustle of designing silicon and a day job of financial engineering. So today, although we have critiques of how some of the frames look, we are trying to keep perspective that this isn't made by a $1 trillion company. Sorry, 4 trillion. Anyway, both LSFG and LS1 are machine learned and able to be used across almost any modern GPU and in almost any game without needing special integrations. This positions it as a unique one-size-fits-all tool for situations where brand-specific upscaling or frame gen are absent. The newest LSFG version featured at the time we're working on this is version 3.1, and that has 2 featured modes. Fixed mode uses a static multiplier to set the ratio of total displayed frames per 1 real frame. A multiplier of 4 would result in 3 non-game frames being basically interpolated between 2 real frames. It can be manually set from 1 to 20. Things get weird at 20. Adaptive mode dynamically adjusts to fractional multipliers in order to maintain a user-defined target frame rate, independent of the game's actual frame rate. Conceptually, adaptive mode prioritizes visual smoothness over image quality and latency. The developer calls out the use case of playing games with hard frame rate caps that don't align with the refresh rate of the monitor. For example, Dark Souls 3 is capped at 60 FPS without mods, so perfectly matching a 144Hz monitor would otherwise be impossible. You can mod it to work, but that's not really the point here. In our opinion, missing out on 24 extra fake frames per second at 120 FPS and a game locked at 60 Hz base rate doesn't really seem that bad. In theory, this could even feel microstuttery, as the relationship between the game's internal state and its visual state would be sort of cyclical and grow and shrink, which gets into actually an argument for animation error, simulation time error, and we have a separate video coming up on that where we have some new methodology we're introducing for benchmarking. But anyway, adaptive mode can also be used when the base frame rate is unstable, and the user's preference is to sacrifice image quality in favor of visual smoothness during periods of lower base performance. The other effects of lower FPS would still be felt, like higher total system latency. As for actual upscaling, Lossless Scaling has 10 different options available. We're going to stick to LS1 today, which seems to be their most interesting and, as far as we can tell, the one that is the most worth focusing on. Of course, we're open to, if people want us to really look at some other one, we'll consider it. But we need to narrow the scope of where we're starting today with this, because it's going to be a lot to compare already. So LS1 is what we're doing. The main drawback is that LS1 doesn't get information from the game, but that's basically DLSS, FSR, and XeSS. The vendors have that level of access to developers. So LS1 is, as a result of that, purely spatial, and it's applied to finished frames from the game. It allows for multiplicative scale factors between 1 and 10, but it also has an auto mode. There's also a sharpness slider from 0 to 4, with 1 as the default. As for using it, the target application has to be running in either windowed or borderless mode, and sometimes we had trouble getting borderless to work, like in Baldur's Gate 3. To make matters more complicated, some games have full screen mode that isn't actually exclusive full screen, and that allows lossless scaling to work anyway. Here's the full list of upscalers, and there's community guides as well to explain what each of these do. They're not all for the same task. For example, XBR is intended strictly for pixel art games. This level of minutia and detail is what makes lossless scaling a fun option for enthusiasts who like tweaking settings. If you're into reading guides and getting the most out of a technology, it might be a fun thing to experiment with. It maybe has some use cases for emulation or something as well. LS1 and FSR both have lighter weight alternate versions called Performance and Optimized, respectively, which are provided as a trade-off of increased performance at the cost of some visual fidelity. As for how lossless scaling works, both the upscaling and the frame gen functionality are done after the original frames are rendered, with lossless scaling capturing the completed frames via the DXGI API. For frame generation, lossless scaling captures finished frames from the game, downscales them, uses the downscaled frames to estimate motion data between them, uses that data to render a full-res warp of the first original frame, then displays them in sequential order. Real frame 1, generated frame, real frame 2. The flow scale slider acts as the multiplier to control how downscaled the frames are that get used for estimating motion. This is not the same thing as having upscaling and frame gen on at the same time. So upping the frame gen multiplier just increases the amount of warp steps that happen between real frame 1 and real frame 2, which increases lossless scaling's load on the GPU. So there's some overhead here. This increases visual frame rate at the cost of lowering potentially the real frame rate because of that overhead, and it's one of the main areas where additional latency from frame generation comes from. For upscaling, it's a relatively simple process where lossless scaling takes the captured frame, then applies its model to render a replacement frame at the desired output resolution. The original frames are never displayed. These functions demand compute time on the GPU, even if it's far less time than drawing a real frame. The developer states that it works best when the GPU has untapped headroom, usually accomplished by capping the game's base frame rate. Lossless scaling also has a dual GPU mode, where the work is offloaded to a second GPU. This allows the primary GPU to focus on just the game without needing to juggle additional load. And it's not some kind of SLI or something with AFR, it's handling the processing for this task specifically. So it's kind of cool. It's a niche use case, but it could be useful for some of you who might have a secondary older GPU lying around that's still capable of doing this kind of processing. Now, for the frame generation testing, we captured on a test bench running a 9800X3D. We're using the RTX 5090, and we're using 2x frame gen captured at 4K 120 FPS. So this is our normal GPU test bench, basically. At higher multipliers, we capped the frames at 50 FPS for the frame rate, and we captured at 200 FPS, which is strictly to ensure we stayed within the capture solution's limitations. We used the recommended flow scale of 50% for 4K, WGC capture mode, sync mode set to off, allow tearing, and a max frame latency of 4. And for anyone at home considering trying this software, this isn't like our recommendation or advice on what to use, this is just us controlling the software settings that we're using for testing purposes. So we'll mostly be analyzing fixed frame mode with 2x and 4x multipliers. We've got some 10x and some 20x just for fun, just because they can do it. And within the comparisons themselves, we'll be looking for any kind of visual artifacts or errant behavior. All right, first up, we have the scripted Dragoon scene from Final Fantasy XVI. It has sections of both high and low contrast, as well as very fast character and camera movement that strain LSFG's capabilities. Starting with the 2x multiplier and 50% playback speed, if we loop the section where he flips his lance mid-air, we can tell there's some blur and general strangeness. It's hard to make out exactly what's happening. Slowing to 25% speed makes it more obvious that the shape of the lance is breaking down in movement, especially as it passes over the rest of his armor. We've seen this with DLSS and FSR in the past, where movement of one object across another defined object can cause breakdown of the clarity, and actually we've seen this in this game before as well with the other technologies. Dropping down to frame by frame shows LSFG failing to cope with large gaps in position between real frames. On nearly every generated frame, the lance splits in two, as if it were in quantum superposition. It's especially clear when the Dragoon first leaps upwards off the spire. For many of the pixels in motion, LSFG isn't drawing a middle position between frames. It's drawing both positions, and doing so poorly. There are some areas where it doesn't fail, like the upper leg armor, which tracks more accurately on the generated fake frames. Overall, though, it's an extremely sudden burst of motion that, due to the limitations of perception for things you're probably not staring directly at, it ultimately just kind of feels like a blurry mess on the screen. As a reminder, we allowed the games to run at 60 FPS for 2x frame gen in order to give LSFG a strong base to work with, so it would only get worse with lower FPS. If you're running at 45 or 50, it'd degrade further. For 4x frame gen with the game at 50 FPS, there's an extra 3.33 milliseconds between real frames, so LSFG has to bridge a slightly wider visual gap. Other strange behaviors manifest, like the starry sky flickering and seeming to churn and swim as the Dragoon spins his lance. One positive for LSFG is that it keeps UI elements surprisingly solid, one exception being subtitled text as it morphs into existence, but it's not too noticeable in motion. UI elements have been a repeat issue for all frame generation technologies, so when it does well, it's notable. Next is Cyberpunk 2077, as we blast through the middle of Corpo Plaza, which feels like it's becoming more of a real place every day. At well over 100 miles per hour, even Johnny gets a little nervous.
Slow down, Turbo. You'll get us killed. Again.
At 2x frame gen, LSFG doesn't look bad at full speed, but we're limited to 60 FPS on YouTube, with this video at least, so we're not able to convey this. Normal speed helps mask issues, which may be enough for a lot of people using it. If it helps things feel smoother and it doesn't produce obvious problems regularly, then that's sort of the objective. Slowing it down to 50% is where some issues start to become visible, like the appearance of flickering on the concrete columns on the left side of the road. There's also warping on the grid-like middle divider of the highway, but at 100% speed and zoomed at a normal play window without just looking in this closely, it is harder to see in actual gameplay. Going down to 25% speed reveals the most visible frame gen artifacts on the middle divider. It's clear now that the repeating grid is warping. It was just difficult to make out in the faster playback. Dropping down to frame by frame draws into sharp contrast the areas where LSFG does well versus where it struggles. V's car looks great since it's not moving that much on the screen, and the same goes for most of the UI elements. On the negative side, the arrows on the road look really busted on the generated frames. So do some of the passing cars during the fake frames. Moving up to 4x frame gen, up to 3 fakes for every 1 real, tells the same story. Totally passable in full motion, but when slowed down to frame by frame, the errors become apparent. The middle divider, the road arrows, the passing cars, the concrete columns yet again, and debris from the crash at the end show massive warping. At 10x, we can no longer capture every frame, but we find some of the worst issues, like the streetlight poles phasing in and out of existence as we pass, cars turning into impressionist paintings that prior to generative AI might have gotten some kind of artsy award, and the utter mess of wrecking at the end. We don't think multipliers this high are supposed to be taken seriously, but they are funny. And they're funnier because we could put them on the charts next to NVIDIA's MFG4X. Isn't that fun? We can just arbitrarily multiply frames by anything. By contrast, slow-moving scenes like the canned benchmark with 4x frame gen only show obvious issues when objects wipe across the screen, like the bottle in this woman's hand, or her arm as it slips out of view. We also see a trail of distortion behind the doors as they slide open. Next up is Marvel Rivals and the built-in benchmark scene, starting with 2x frame gen mode. We'll skip full speed and go to 50%. Nothing immediately jumps out as problematic throughout the smooth panning of the on-rails camera and the first team fight from Venom's point of view. Overall, this is a good start. At 25% speed, we see two Lokis. That's not LSFG's fault, that's just because there's two of them. But more importantly, the jumping Loki's staff visually stutters as he moves across the screen. His health bar also blurs. Dropping down to a frame-by-frame analysis shows what's actually happening. On every other frame, different parts of both jumping Loki and the background morph sometimes form double images. The staff, his horns, the brick wall, and the paper bag mask graffiti on the building in the right of the background all distort as he goes by. Now we'll go to 4x mode, again frame by frame. As Venom attacks Emma Frost, there are numerous instances of double images on the tentacles coming from his back. Sometimes you can also catch the names and health bars warp as other effects go off. This is one of the major downsides of LSFG not being tied to the engine in the game like modern DLSS and FSR. It can't correctly distinguish between UI elements and the 3D game space. That said, the UI elements that don't move stay admirably stable considering the limited access. Next, we'll move back to 2x mode in a more isolated scenario in the training range where we do a long wall run with Rocket. At 50% speed, it's not that bad, but we can tell something's going wrong with the railing. Objects of this shape have been a challenge for all frame generation over time so far. At 25% speed, artifacts on the repeating triangular pattern directly in line with Rocket become discernible. Going frame by frame shows the truth. The triangles on both the purple ridge Rocket's running along and the guardrail above it get jumbled up badly, morphing, shifting, and overlapping. We also see more of the splitting or doubling behavior, like on the vertical posts, or the white lines on the purple banners. Lossless scaling has a sort of comical aspect in that you can go up to 20x, which is mostly just funny because we'd love to put it on a chart next to MFG4X, but it's not particularly useful, but it is funny, and the fact that they're not marketing this as like turn 40 FPS into 800 FPS, that makes it hard to be upset about. If they did that, that's a different story, but that's not how it's presented. They're not, I mean, they're not doing anything crazy, you know, like no one would ever say that a 5070 is equal to a 4090.
With the Blackwell family RTX 5070, 4090 performance at 549.
And no one would say that. And so, because they're not marketing it that way for Lossless Scaling, we're okay with it. It's kind of funny. It's nothing compared to 20x, though, where LSFG makes up to 19 frames between every 2 actual game frames. This is the future. We don't expect this to be good, to be clear, but it is amusing, so we'll look at it. And it's where things get weird. Visual instability and general acid tripness is more widespread now, where we see problems basically everywhere. I mean, that's basically our job every day, but in this case, they're digital problems. The railings constantly lose shape, and Rocket leaves visual distortion in his wake as he passes by everything. When Rocket's running towards the camera, the entire left edge of the screen becomes distorted soup. LSFG has no idea what to do with the new visual elements entering the frame at this setting. On some level, it's commendable for not being completely broken at such an extreme ratio, and it's also commendable that they give you the option to use it even if you don't want it. We can respect that. You can force it to look worse if you have an even lower frame rate than the 42-ish base FPS we're getting here. LSFG was taking that and outputting over 800 fake FPS at any given moment, which is just hilarious. Talk about value. And maybe NVIDIA was right. An RTX 5070 really is a 4090, or actually it's more like 5 of them. We'll wrap up frame gen image quality with one that LSFG handles pretty well. 2x frame gen in Space Marine 2 and the decapitation mission performs overall well for LSFG. and it's one we've used in the past for comparisons for the branded technologies. It's very difficult to spot anomalies here, especially if you're actually moving at play speed, but there are a handful. Most obvious are the leading edges of the Space Marine's leg armor, which exhibit brief warp-y characteristics, made most obvious when looking through one frame at a time as his right leg moves forward. The Space Marines, of course, do not appreciate the warp. That is, unless they're in one of the traitor legions, such as the Thousand Sons or the World Eaters, whose Primarch Angron is banished. And that's why we don't allow traitor Space Marine armies at GN Wargaming Night. Anyway, the strict side-scrolling motion of this particular capture is easier for LSFG to handle. All of the generated frames are blurrier than the real ones. This is easiest to see by zooming in and going frame by frame on the guardsmen. Likewise, going frame by frame and zooming on the statues helps to show the blurriness. The same goes for the murals. Despite some of the blurriness, overall, this one works pretty well for LSFG. Up next are upscaling image quality comparisons. We performed upscaling image quality capture on the same bench at 4K 60 FPS. We set the games to run at 1080p, with Lossless Scaling LS1 bringing them up to 4K. We also did some other tests. Even though it supports scaling from a borderless window, it doesn't always work, and didn't for us in Baldur's Gate 3. Scaling from regular windowed mode always worked for us though, including Baldur's Gate 3. Up front, it's important to understand that LS1 isn't really a direct competitor to current-gen DLSS and FSR. Both of those get game engine info to help them, and they generally look better as a result of that. We're saving full competitive analysis between the differing methods for the future. This time we're just focused on the lossless upscaling solution. We have two sets of A/B comparisons. One is native 4K versus LS1 upscaling. The other is more in focus as it's the minimum bar for acceptability, we think, and that's native 1080p versus 1080p upscaled to 4K with LS1 to see if it's an improvement. First up is Marvel Rivals, using the built-in benchmark scene. We'll start by comparing native 1080p versus LS1 upscaling from 1080p to 4K. We can already see a couple things in the starting room. On the positive side, LS1 gives more definition to the wood on the right-hand back wall. UI elements like the attack symbol in the middle of the screen and the segment text along the top of the screen are clearer. On the negative side, the shadowed wooden floor between the bench and the pillar is grainy with LS1 in a way that's unpleasant compared to native 1080p. Now comparing versus native 4K, LS1 upscaling looks straight up crunchy. It's really obvious on the wooden floorboards. This is over-sharpening, probably resulting from the game's native sharpening and LS1 sharpening cascading together. Looking past that, hard edges like on the bench to the left look super aliased and jagged, looking like 1080p by comparison. After the camera rounds the corner, we start to get a look at character models. At a distance, the difference between native 1080p and LS1 upscaling is subtle, mostly falling to a difference in softness. Throwing 4K into the mix is night and day. Loki's fur cape is just a clump of gray pixels with LS1, but actually has definition at 4K. The same goes for Luna Snow's entire model. With LS1, the colored borders around all of them are exaggerated. We'll now add 4K to compare all three. Zooming in on the corner of this roof shows what we interpret as degradation on LS1's part versus native 1080p in reference to native 4K. LS1 subtly disturbs the circles and the flower motifs on the round ends of the roof tiles and provides zero meaningful improvement to the larger golden flower at the very corner. Overall, in Marvel Rivals, LS1 behaves more like a blur removal tool than anything else, and over-sharpens at default settings. In Baldur's Gate 3, scaling doesn't seem to properly apply itself when the game is in borderless mode. We were able to get it to work in windowed mode, though. Here's native 1080p versus LS1. It's an improvement overall. The change isn't massive, but it is better. Most things just look generally sharper. Some of that is in a good way, like the red robes of the character in the foreground. The cobblestone road is another example. The floating NPC chatter text is another place it looks better. Some of the sharpening, though, is in a bad way, like the aliased crunch factor of any fine edge on a character model. There's a few examples here. LS1 isn't necessarily more detailed, but it gives us an impression of clarity that native 1080 lacks. Compared to native 4K, only LS1's UI holds up to similar quality. Let's look at the half-orc and tiefling on the right. LS1 successfully makes the detail on the tiefling's shirt become more discernible, but the ridges on the character's tail only come through at true native 4K until we move much closer. LS1 is also incapable of restoring the zigzag detail on the half-orc's shoulders that's shown in the higher native resolution. In this camp scene, Gale's hair is noticeably worse with LS1 upscaling versus native 1080p. However, the player model looks surprisingly similar in close-up dialogue across all three captures. So as we've seen with DLSS and FSR testing in the past, it really depends on the details you're looking at. There are pros and cons with LS1, just like there are with frame generation and technologies like DLSS, XeSS, and FSR. DLSS and FSR, for the ones we've tested though, both have a distinct advantage in their more direct integration with game development studios, and we'll look at XeSS eventually. The lossless scaling solution we're looking at today provides usefulness for cases where DLSS or FSR aren't available, such as particularly old hardware. It's also just another implementation of something, and it's made by a third party, which makes it kind of interesting. Finally, 4K mostly just reduces the crawling effect on fine lines and edges in this test with Baldur's Gate 3. Next is Space Marine 2, back in the decapitation mission. We'll start with the statue on the left side of the stairs. Details on the statue's base, arm, and shoulder, and the louvered columns behind it, come through better with LS1 than at native 1080p. The difference in fidelity of the player's armor is subtle, but present. LS1 gives a reasonable boost in definition to the base 1080 image, to the point that, in motion and actively playing rather than dissecting image quality like we're doing today, it'd be hard to notice versus 4K, for the most part. It's easier to see the gap in quality when comparing mid to far away elements, like the highly detailed stonework of the walls, the handrails, for example, and the statues. Here's a static scene inside the hangar. Zooming in on the Thunderhawk to the left, LS1 doesn't do much versus native 1080p, but it gives slightly more definition to the top-mounted cannon and the engine under the wing. Native 4K, unsurprisingly, looks better. The various emblems on the side are clearer. Distant and fine details like these light towers also show how LS1 really can't do anything when the original detail is missing in the original 1080p image. It's not capable of generating something that wasn't there to begin with, and it doesn't advertise that capability. Native 4K shows how it's supposed to look. Space Marine 2 is one of the better showings for LS1 overall. It's not as good as native, as we just saw. It's not as good as higher resolutions, but the objective is typically to hit a good enough bar that people needing extra performance can't really notice the upscaling limitations with. We've established the patterns with LS1 upscaling, so we'll quickly go through the last two comparisons. The Dragoon scene in Final Fantasy XVI gives us an example with high contrast. Compared to native 1080p, LS1 upscaling to 4K lifts a slight visual haze from the chest, head, and shoulder armor via tightening up all the edges. The improvement is small, but applies generally to everything, so we found it to be noticeable. Native 4K naturally brings more detail, but LS1 holds its own when considering that it's purely a spatial upscaler without the more advanced implementation of the brand-made alternatives. During the Dragoon's dive, the embroidery on the back of his cape holds the most striking difference and just sort of cleans up the image. After the Dragoon lands, one huge visual difference is in the fidelity of Clive's chainmail armor. It loses most of its depth with LS1, appearing flat. Despite this, we think LS1 looks a little better overall than native 1080p. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, starting off with a static scene inside Lizzie's bar. LS1 is less blurry than native 1080p and brings a convincing level of sharpness back to the intricately detailed mural along the left wall. On the negative side, it's unable to do anything about the crawling, aliased lines on the alternating horizontal and vertical panels of the back wall. This is exactly the type of texturing and geometry that's difficult for upscaling solutions to tackle, though. The mix and match of finer details, especially with alternating directions in the pattern, can sometimes create this appearance. 1080p upscaled with LS1 isn't as crisp as 4K, obviously, and this is mostly visible in the failure to capture finer textures on the sleeve and collar of the jacket worn by the woman on the left. Looking at the perforated metal panel in the background above the crowd, we see that LS1 also incorrectly replicates an aliasing effect that isn't there at 4K. It's clear that visual stability of fine details isn't something that LS1 handles well. All right, so we have two many conclusions for this. One is frame generation, and one is on the upscaling side of things. So to really reinforce this, lossless scaling is a cool third-party utility. It does some things that the first-party vendor solutions don't do yet, but it's not really expected to be generally better than them. It doesn't have the level of access, doesn't have the level of integration, and so where a first-party solution exists and has been manually tuned and has been integrated by developers, probably that's going to be better. The reason this is cool is because it's fully agnostic, and some niche secondary use cases like an extra GPU for processing this task, that's a cool feature to throw in there. plus the adaptive frame generation is sort of interesting. So it's not going to be as strictly good as native implementations from NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel, but it is pretty interesting. And we didn't test all the features today. There's a lot of them, including different upscaling methods that could be applicable towards, for example, emulated games and pixel art games, especially those of the past. So this is a big potential use case for it. We've seen some forum commentary of people using lossless scaling for emulation and upscaling. We've only tested the aspects we talked about today and the games we looked at today, so we'll focus our conclusion on that. If there's interest in the other components specifically, we can try to carve out time for them. Let's start with going back to frame generation. Lossless scaling's LSFG is useful, but with some hard limiting factors. It's not magic. Like any frame generation technology, you're not going to make 15 FPS feel like 30. The generated frames often severely distort or duplicate objects in motion. It's just that ideally, the frames go by quickly enough that you don't usually absorb the errors as anything more than general blur or instability. There are some instances where that's true, and playing the game rather than dissecting its frames like we've been doing will make that more likely that you don't see them. That's why we're playing this stuff at normal speed right now. So this is where use case matters. No frame gen tech is suited to making an unplayable game playable, no matter what Jensen Huang says on stage when he contradicts his own marketing team. Both the visual fidelity and latency become huge problems when your base frame rate gets low enough. If you want that increased smoothness and can tolerate the hit to clarity and the added latency, it's worth trying out. That said, our opinion is that frame gen past 2x isn't useful. One thing that impressed us is how LSFG managed to be the first with adaptive frame gen, as far as we can tell, with an FPS target. That seems like the kind of thing NVIDIA would introduce on stage at its next GPU launch event to try and move people over to the new architecture. And then AMD would scramble and trip over itself and fuck up all its marketing to try and catch up to the feature that NVIDIA just added. And then Intel would hopefully still exist. That would be an accomplishment. With adaptive mode, it's cool to see an independent developer sort of get one over on the world's most valuable company. When it comes to actually doing upscaling, Lossless Scaling's LS1 model ranges from slightly better to rough. We don't know if it's technically possible, but subjectively it feels like it's overdue for an upgrade, especially since LSFG has been getting all the polish for a couple years now. In the better examples we saw, using LS1 to go from 1080p to 4K gave a mild boost to clarity, like in Space Marine 2. In bad examples, it caused over-sharpening, like in Baldur's Gate 3, or just didn't really provide that much value. So LS1 is kind of the more aged part of this rather than the frame generation, which has gotten all the interest. In other words, the LS1 scaling didn't come anywhere close to looking like native 4K, so just temper your expectations. You're not going to get that, broadly speaking. LS1 often felt limited to being a blur reduction tool, still useful, but not game-changing. Maybe good enough as an alternative agnostic solution for just helping with the frame rate. Fundamentally, the spatial-only nature of LS1 is a double-edged sword. On the good side, it doesn't introduce the temporal artifacts that can be seen with DLSS or FSR in bad use cases. Also good is how widely compatible it is. It also doesn't care about what engine the game is running on. But it's always going to be at a disadvantage compared to the first-party upscaling options of FSR, DLSS, and XeSS unless something changes. The extra data these have to work with is an advantage in their favor. Again, there are other scaling options beyond LS1. We just chose that, it seems the most prevalent. And if there's enough interest in other methods, we can look at them as well. But we'd rather see an update here first. So for what it's marketed for, we think Lossless Scaling is a pretty interesting tool. It has a lot of options. As an enthusiast, you might just have fun tweaking the settings in the apps. We mostly use the settings that were recommended by the application's developers in their user guides. There are, of course, alternative settings you could use. We didn't test all of them. The main viability is probably in specific use cases like emulation, again, not that we would know, and for older cards or things where there's no direct hardware support for some of the newer solutions. Well, that's kind of what makes this application so interesting is there's so many ways to use it. We didn't test all of them. There's a lot of them, too much for one video. We mostly focused on sort of traditional gaming use cases. And again, in scenarios where there's overlap with solutions from multi-billion or trillion-dollar silicon companies, and when you have hardware that supports those tend to be superior. But for an indie developer unfunded by infinite money glitches, and for its agnosticism, we think Lossless Scaling is pretty cool, even if the image quality isn't as good. And really, again, in the situations we tested today, it's not. It's the versatility that gets it some usefulness elsewhere. So we're glad Lossless Scaling exists. It is not a silver bullet. It's not going to make everything perfect all of a sudden, but it's cool. It has some interesting features. It's hard to be mad at something that is like completely agnostic from a first-party vendor supplier and is made by just an independent separate developer altogether. So it's a neat tool. We hope it improves. We definitely like independent competition in this part of the market. Speaking of that, we just saw that there's another tool called Borderless Gaming we have not tested, and they are apparently planning on implementing their own frame generation and upscaling models in the future. So could be a developing space, but that's it for this one. That's your look at lossless scaling and most heavily the frame generation side of it. And then we'll continue to look at this stuff as there's more to talk about. XESS we still haven't gotten to, but we've done DLSS and FSR now for their 2025 updates as well. So that'll be it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly, like by grabbing one of these Blind Eye t-shirts that we're selling on the store, one of our PC building mod bats, and we will see you all next time.